Northern Italy, March 1945. Captain William Blackout Barnes reached for his throttle and did something that every flight instructor in the Army Air Forces had told him never to do. He cut his engine at 12,000 feet. The thundering roar of the Pratt & Whitney radial died instantly. The propeller windmilled to a stop. The cockpit fell silent except for the whisper of wind across the canopy. His P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of aircraft, fuel, and ordnance, began to fall. Below him, carved into the side of an Alpine mountain, was a railway tunnel that had survived 37 bombing attempts, 37 missions, hundreds of bombs, dozens of aircraft lost. The tunnel was still open. German supply trains were still rolling through it every night, feeding the Gothic Line defenses that were killing American soldiers. Every previous mission had failed because the target was impossible. The tunnel entrance was only 40 feet wide. It was surrounded by anti-aircraft positions. The mountain walls created wind shear that threw bombs off course. Standard bombing techniques couldn't hit it, but Barnes wasn't using standard techniques. He was falling in complete silence, invisible to the German sound detectors, his aircraft a ghost in the Alpine sky. At 3,000 feet, he would restart his engine. At 1,500 feet, he would release his bomb. And if his calculations were correct, that bomb would fly directly into the tunnel mouth like a dart into a bullseye. If his calculations were wrong, he would be just another smoking crater on an Italian mountainside. The Brenner Pass Railway was the lifeline of the German army in Italy. Every bullet, every shell, every gallon of fuel that reached the Gothic Line came through the Alps via this single railway corridor. Destroy the railway, and the German defenses would starve. For 2 years, Allied bombers had tried. They'd bombed the tracks. The Germans repaired them overnight. They'd bombed the bridges. The Germans built bypasses. They'd bombed the marshalling yards. The Germans dispersed their trains. But there was one target that couldn't be repaired overnight. One target that couldn't be bypassed. One target that, if destroyed, would shut down the entire railway for months. The Fortezza Tunnel. Carved through solid Alpine granite, the tunnel stretched for nearly a mile through the mountain. Its entrance was a narrow portal cut into a sheer cliff face. Inside, the tunnel curved slightly, making it impossible to see through. Intelligence estimated that collapsing the tunnel would require a direct hit inside the entrance. A bomb that flew through the 40-foot opening and detonated against the interior walls. From 20,000 feet, hitting a 40-foot target was like throwing a baseball through a window from a mile away. From lower altitudes, the anti-aircraft defenses were murderous. The Germans knew the tunnel's value. They had ringed the approaches with 80mm flak guns, 20mm autocannons, and machine gun nests. They had positioned sound detection equipment to give early warning of approaching aircraft. They had stationed fighters at nearby airfields. 37 missions had tried to hit the tunnel. 37 missions had failed. The closest anyone had come was a bomb that struck the cliff face 20 feet above the entrance. The explosion had scorched the rock but left the tunnel completely functional. By early 1945, the tunnel had become a symbol of German engineering superiority. A target that couldn't be hit, a problem that couldn't be solved. Then Captain Barnes started asking questions. William Barnes wasn't a bomber pilot. He flew P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy fighters designed for ground attack and air superiority. His job was strafing, dive bombing, and dogfighting. Precision strategic bombing was someone else's problem. But Barnes had grown up in the mountains of Colorado. He'd spent his childhood hiking, climbing, and learning to read terrain. He understood how mountains created their own weather, their own wind patterns, their own rules. When he heard about the Fortezza tunnel failures, something bothered him. "Why are all the bombs missing in the same direction?" he asked during a briefing. The intelligence officer shrugged. "Wind shear. The mountains create unpredictable currents." Unpredictable, or just unaccounted for. Barnes started studying the reconnaissance photos. He noticed patterns that the bomber crews had missed. The bombs weren't scattering randomly. They were all landing to the right of the target, consistently, every single mission. That meant the wind wasn't unpredictable at all. It was blowing in a consistent direction, probably a thermal current rising along the south-facing cliff. If you knew the wind pattern, you could compensate for it. But there was still the altitude problem. High-altitude bombing gave the wind too much time to push the bomb off course. Even with perfect compensation, the margin of error at 20,000 feet was too large for a 40-foot target. Low-altitude bombing eliminated the wind problem but created a survival problem. Below 8,000 feet, the flak was deadly. Barnes needed a middle ground, a way to get low enough for accuracy but avoid the anti-aircraft fire. That's when he remembered something from his childhood. Here's what Barnes realized. The German sound detectors could hear an aircraft engine from miles away. They gave the flak gunners time to prepare, to track, to aim, but they couldn't hear what they couldn't detect. A gliding aircraft, engine off, propeller still, made almost no sound. It was functionally invisible to acoustic detection. If Barnes cut his engine at high altitude and glided down to attack altitude, the Germans wouldn't know he was coming until he was already gone. The silence would be his weapon. Barnes began experimenting in secret. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed for gliding. It was built like a flying anvil, heavy, powerful, optimized for speed and firepower rather than aerodynamic efficiency. But heavy didn't mean uncontrollable. Barnes discovered that with the engine off, the P-47 glided at a ratio of roughly 8-to-1. For every 1,000 feet of altitude lost, the aircraft traveled about 8,000 feet forward. From 12,000 feet, that gave him nearly 20 miles of glide range. More importantly, he discovered the dive characteristics. With the engine off, the P-47 became remarkably stable in a dive. No engine torque, no propeller wash, just clean aerodynamics and gravity. He could point the nose at a target and hold it there with precision that powered flight couldn't match. The technique was dangerous. Everything about it was dangerous. If the engine didn't restart, he was dead. No power meant no recovery from the dive, no climb out after the attack, no second chances. If he misjudged the glide, he'd arrive at the target too high or too low. Too high meant missing. Too low meant hitting the mountain. If the Germans spotted him visually before he released his bomb, their guns could track him even without sound detection. Barnes practiced for 3 weeks. He learned exactly how long the engine needed to restart. 7 seconds from ignition to full power. He learned the exact altitude where he needed to pull up. He calculated the glide angles, the dive speeds, the release points. He drew diagrams showing exactly when to cut the engine, exactly where to aim, exactly when to restart. His commanding officer thought he was insane. You want to turn off your engine over enemy territory and glide into a mountain? Glide past the mountain, sir. Into the tunnel. That's suicide. It's mathematics. The CO looked at Barnes's calculations, pages of figures, wind charts, glide ratios, bomb trajectories. And if your engine doesn't restart, then I'll have gotten closer than anyone else, sir. The CO should have said no. The mission was unauthorized. The technique was untested in combat. But 37 missions had failed. American soldiers were dying because German supplies kept flowing through that tunnel. Go. But I'm listing you as missing before you take off. That way the paperwork's already done. March 15th, 1945. 05:30 hours, Barnes took off in darkness, climbing toward the Alps as the first light touched the peaks. He carried a single 500-pound bomb modified with a delayed fuse. The delay would give the bomb time to penetrate deep into the tunnel before detonating. If he hit the entrance correctly. The flight to the target area took 40 minutes. Barnes climbed to 14,000 feet, high enough to clear the mountain passes, high enough to begin his descent from well outside German detection range. At 06:15 he reached his start point, a position 10 miles south of the tunnel, perfectly aligned with his calculated approach path. He checked his instruments one final time. Altitude, 14,000 feet. Airspeed, 250 miles per hour. Engine temperature normal. Then he pulled the throttle to idle and began his descent. The first phase was shallow, a gradual power-off glide that traded altitude for distance. Barnes watched the mountains rise around him as he descended into the Alpine valley. At 12,000 feet, he cut the engine completely. The silence was profound. For months, Barnes had lived with the constant roar of the Thunderbolt's engine. Now there was nothing but wind, the whistle of air across the canopy, the creak of the airframe. He was falling through the sky in a 7-ton glider, completely committed. No turning back now. The tunnel was 8 miles ahead. Barnes could see the cliff face where the entrance was carved. The morning sun was just touching the peaks above it, casting long shadows across the approach. He adjusted his trim, checked his airspeed, watched his altitude bleed away. 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. The anti-aircraft positions were visible now, dark shapes on the ridgelines, guns pointed at the sky. But they weren't tracking him. They weren't moving at all. The sound detectors had nothing to hear. Barnes was invisible. At 6,000 feet, Barnes pushed the nose down. The gentle glide became a steep dive. The airspeed climbed rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The wind noise increased from a whisper to a scream, but still silent compared to an engine. The tunnel entrance grew in his windscreen, a dark hole in the gray cliff, 40 feet wide, 20 feet tall. He was aiming at a postage stamp from 2 miles away. Barnes made his wind corrections. The reconnaissance analysis suggested a steady thermal current from the south, pushing aircraft to the right. He aimed left of the tunnel, letting the wind push the bomb toward the center. At 4,000 feet, the Germans finally saw him. Visual spotters on the ridgeline screamed warnings into their radios. The flak guns began to traverse, searching for the diving aircraft. But they were too slow. They'd been expecting the drone of an engine, the distant approach of a bomber formation. Instead, they got a silent ghost screaming down from the sky at 400 miles per hour. The first shells exploded behind Barnes. The gunners were leading for powered flight, anticipating where an aircraft with an engine would be. Barnes had no engine. His trajectory was different. Their calculations were wrong. 3,500 feet. The tunnel entrance filled his gun sight. 3,000 feet. Flak bursting all around him now, but wild, uncoordinated. 2,500 feet. Barnes put his finger on the bomb release. 2,000 feet. The cliff face was enormous, filling his entire windscreen. He could see individual rocks, individual shadows. 2,500 feet. Release. The 500-pound bomb dropped from beneath the P-47's belly. Barnes immediately pulled back on the stick with all his strength. The aircraft groaned. The G-forces slammed him into his seat. His vision narrowed to a tunnel as blood drained from his brain. At the same moment, his left hand found the ignition. Engine restart. 1 second, 2 seconds. The mountain was rushing toward him. The cliff face was impossibly close. 3 seconds. 4. The engine coughed. 5 seconds. The engine caught. The propeller bit air. Power surged through the airframe. Barnes was at 800 feet, screaming past the cliff face, close enough to see the shock on a German soldier's face. He pulled harder. The P-47 clawed for altitude, trading speed for height, climbing away from the mountain that had almost killed him. Behind him, the bomb flew into the darkness of the tunnel. 3 seconds later, the mountain shook. The explosion inside the tunnel was catastrophic. The 500-pound bomb detonated against the curved interior wall, exactly as Barnes had intended. The blast was contained by the granite walls, focused by the tunnel's architecture. The result was a collapse that exceeded anything the engineers had predicted. 40 feet of solid rock came down, blocking the tunnel completely. The debris pile was so massive that repair crews estimated 6 months minimum to clear it. The Brenner Pass Railway was severed. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed the tunnel the next day, intelligence officers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The entrance that had survived 37 bombing attempts was buried under tons of rubble. Smoke was still rising from the debris. 1 bomb, 1 pilot, 1 impossible shot. Barnes landed back at his base to find the ground crews waiting in stunned silence. "You were listed as missing," his crew chief said. "I got better." The after-action report took 3 days to complete. Intelligence officers interviewed Barnes repeatedly, trying to understand exactly what he had done. "You cut your engine at 12,000 feet. "Yes, sir." "And glided 10 miles to the target." "Approximately, sir." "In a P-47, which isn't designed for gliding." "It glides fine, sir. Just not efficiently." The officers looked at each other. "And you restarted the engine at 800 feet while pulling out of a dive." "Closer to 600 feet, sir, by the time it caught." "I was a bit concerned." "A bit concerned." "Yes, sir." The commanding officer who had listed Barnes as missing before takeoff tore up the paperwork personally. "Next time, maybe give me a little more warning before you invent a new form of attack." Yes, sir? Sorry, sir. The silent dive technique Barnes pioneered didn't become standard doctrine. It was too dangerous, too dependent on individual skill. Too many things could go wrong. But the principle behind it, using silence as a tactical advantage, influenced military aviation for decades. Modern stealth technology follows the same logic. If the enemy can't detect you, they can't defend against you. Barnes achieved with engine shutdown what modern aircraft achieve with radar-absorbing materials and engineered silence. The Fortezza tunnel remained closed for the rest of the war. German supply lines never recovered. The Gothic Line defenses weakened, then crumbled. Historians estimate that the tunnel's closure saved hundreds of American lives, soldiers who would have died assaulting positions that were instead abandoned due to supply shortages. One bomb, one tunnel, one crazy pilot who turned off his engine over the Alps. Barnes received the Distinguished Service Cross for the mission. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and innovative tactical thinking. It didn't mention that his commanding officer had written him off as dead before he even took off. William Barnes flew 43 more missions before the war ended. None of them required cutting his engine at 12,000 feet. He went home to Colorado, married his high school sweetheart, and became a commercial pilot. He flew passengers across the Rocky Mountains for 30 years, never once turning off his engine mid-flight. But sometimes, on clear days when the peaks reminded him of the Alps, he'd think about that morning in March 1945, the silence of the glide, the mountain rushing toward him, the moment when the engine caught and he knew he was going to live, the tunnel that couldn't be hit, the shot that couldn't be made. Everyone said it was impossible. Barnes just did the mathematics. And then he turned off his engine and fell out of the sky. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem isn't a better weapon or a bigger bomb. Sometimes it's just silence and the courage to fall. If this story of impossible precision and calculated insanity gripped you, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel uncovers the untold stories of World War II, the unconventional tactics, the impossible missions, and the warriors who did what everyone said couldn't be done. Tap the bell so you never miss an upload. And drop a comment below. I want to know. Would you have trusted that engine to restart at 600 feet, or would you have kept the power on? Share this video with someone who appreciates real military history. And check out the video on screen right now for another story of impossible missions that changed the war. I'll see you in the next one.